everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dan, and this is the Having Initiative podcast. Today's topic is education. Now, I've mentioned this a couple of times earlier on in the podcast. And in fact, the first episode, there was a really big point I made about this and why I even started the podcast in the first place. So, in this episode, we're going to start talking about education. And it's a really big topic with school in general. I'm going to be referring mostly to public school, kind of K through 12. And so a lot of people are saying a lot of things about what we should or shouldn't be doing with school, again, K through 12. And a lot of those ideas I do find to be really good, but the sheer amount of things that they are saying we should do to schools are adding burdens to teachers and the school as a whole. And there are some ideas that I think aren't as good, or there's nuance to how that thing should be taught in one way or another. A lot of people also give their views on what the problem with school is. Like, the problem with school these days is this thing. And sometimes they go into say, like, okay, and if we just fix that one thing, then everything will at least improve in some regard, not necessarily fix everything. So I've been trying to explore as many viewpoints as possible and then go deeper into those ideas and suggestions that are put forth and try to find out their validity, no matter how dumb I think some of the assertions might be. And it's been interesting. It's a lot of work, and I don't nearly know everything by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't think there is one single answer to how to fix things in general. So in this episode, I'm going to give some general musings on things related to education. So let's talk about the education system. And just a reminder, for the time being, I'm talking about public school in America. If I talk about anything else, I'll try and let you know beforehand. So here's some of the problems that I hear people say with school these days. Less money or funding, underpaid teachers, not enough training to those teachers or the administrative counseling staff, overcrowded schools, the learning is focused on passing standardized tests, the school is focused on getting kids into college and not necessarily a good education, standards are being lowered, the government is intervening and, depending on the action and political motive, people from all over the political spectrum agree or disagree with politicians saying schools will now teach this kind of thing or cannot teach this kind of thing. Parents not involved, and students in general, society is causing them issues that's preventing them from thriving. So yeah, that's a lot of issues. I'm going to go into each one of them. Now, before I get started, in my experience, I am fully of the mind that if you want a student, child, or adult, because I have experience teaching adults, if you want them to be successful at any level in any subject, regardless of the resources at your and their disposal, if you want them to be successful, all parties involved, the student, their peers, parents, that's more for kids, the teacher involved, administration or politicians or whatnot, they all have to truly want the student to learn and grow. Okay, they truly must be out for the best interest of the student. Now, this may seem like common sense, but I find that most of the aforementioned problems stem from somebody consciously or otherwise having a different motive than wanting this student to become smarter, better, more well-adjusted, more knowledgeable, whatever you want to call it. So let's get started. So less money or funding. We hear about education cuts all the time. You may have heard my interview with Ron Wilkins where you learn I was a musician. And yeah, there were definitely cuts to the arts programs, and that had to be compensated with the parent booster organizations doing fundraising, and we had to help in that too. So, but you hear about education cuts like for learning as well, just funding in general to schools. But according to the annual Census Bureau's annual survey of school style finances and the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers from 2002 to 2019, the tax revenue per student has increased 24% nationally, taking inflation into account. Now, there's always anecdotes, of course. There are some areas where there have definitely been cuts, but other areas have had increases in funding for education. And I've looked into that, and yeah, you'd be surprised that there's actually been a lot more funding thrown at things, and there hasn't been an improvement with education. And so there isn't a great correlation with more money and better educational outcomes. Now, if we're talking hypotheticals here, definitely having more tools and resources can open a door. Like I heard that a school in a relatively rural area, basically, I forget the exact details, but the school had iPads that were property of the school district, and they kind of loaned them out to the students, or not loan, check them out to the students for particular online content. And when they did that, and with the curriculum that they were doing, whatever they were doing, there was a noticeable increase or improvement in reading comprehension among other various school metrics. Now, the problem with that, I think that the district was doing something dirty or underhanded, or like there was a string attached or something, and so they had to stop doing that policy. So yes, more resources can open doors, but whether or not anyone goes through it is a different issue. And remember what I said about everyone involved needs to want a positive outcome, and probably piggybacking off that, have to have some sort of agreement on what that outcome is and how to get there. Money won't work if the parties involved, better education isn't truly the desired outcome. And I'll elaborate on various points in this later on. And by the way, I mentioned the national averages, but every situation in every state, county, district, and school can vary. So bear that in mind when we're talking about the aggregate. Okay, another issue that is brought up are underpaid teachers. And generally speaking, yeah, I agree that for the most part, teachers aren't paid terribly well. And when we talked about budget cuts, yeah, that makes sense for, okay, they will take a hit. But I'll also add not just money, but other benefits like retirement or health and whatnot. Those are also things that may be cut or that need to go into paying a teacher. Now, I'm sure that paying teachers more will help in a certain sense, but there has to be nuance. I've been in environments where people can't be fired for incompetence, and it had a really bad effect on morale and productivity. Because the argument with paying teachers more is like, okay, if we pay teachers more, they will either A, more people will be drawn to being teachers, or B, they will feel more content and they will teach better, something like that. Now, in my experience, like 80% or plus of my teachers were great, and maybe 18% were all right, and like 2% were straight up bad. And for some reason or another, the bad teachers generally weren't at the school the next year. That was interesting in hindsight. And so I know this is about paying teachers more, and that's part of it. But also at the same time, there are job security concerns are something that's added to, like, okay, if we pay them more, well, if we also made more guarantees for them, that would also help the situation. And I've had jobs where a crazy customer didn't like some interaction we had, and they tried to get me fired or at least reprimanded. And so I understand that teachers can get in a crossfire against someone, and it's important to have some sort of protection from that one loud, angry, crazy parent. And I've seen some things. But also, pay needs to be, or pay increases, more funding for teachers, that needs to be factored into the number of teachers. and this is a later point, but I've heard how a teacher has to teach 20 students and it drains them, and I don't blame them. I've been in similar situations. But thinking that just throwing money at that one teacher who has to teach 20 students will somehow make them teach the students better or it'll make them less fatigued, th- there's a lot more going on there. So money needs to be allocated to bring down that student to teacher ratio. I saw in California or a story in California about a celebrity that was pushing some sort of legislation for a spending bill that was designed to, like, okay, this is to more funding for schools or something like that. And it didn't pass. And I saw a story where, like, I saw the before where that celebrity was, pushing that bill or whatever it was. And then I saw afterwards when it failed, and they said something like, oh, well, I'm shocked that people don't care enough about the teachers or kids or education that they wouldn't vote to increase spending on it because it's important. And I checked responses to either that article or that celebrity's social media post, and they were filled with anecdotes about how they had either voted for or there had been previous bills for increasing funding for schools or teachers and therefore taxes as a result. So that there had been, bills like this had gone through before, but it only went to existing teachers and not hiring new ones. So a teacher who has a 20-to-1 student ratio, they still had a 20-to-1 student ratio. They were just making more money, or they added on existing benefits, which again, I know a lot of teachers and I do care about them and I want them to be compensated well. But the issue that they were claiming to solve was education, but the student to teacher ratio was a big, thorn in that. And so the increase in money, which was going to go to existing teachers, didn't address it. And so the parents and people living in that area, they didn't want that bill that was going to do that. And so, yeah, I'll elaborate on some of this later. But the point with underpaid teachers that I'm hope you're getting is that there's a lot of particulars. And again, not just pay, but about guarantees of the job. Another topic that I hear about with what's wrong with education or school is that the teachers or the administration don't have enough training to deal with the various things that they need to be dealing with. And the place that I hear this complaint is either about A, we're spending too much of the education degrees learning crowd control or crowd management and not actually how to, foster understanding. Or B, they want teachers to also be mental health experts, counselors, or therapists. And they want teachers to be teaching the kids morals and right from wrong. Now, those are all good things, and I think a teacher can have an influence in that, but I do think too much pressure is being put on teachers. I do think that, teachers are there to teach. They are not there to fix your kid. Now, some of those things get put on the administration, but they are also, just like we're putting more and more pressure on teachers, we're putting more and more pressure on administrators to fix kids. And for the most part, like I said, teachers are there to teach, but there is a little wiggle room for that other stuff. So this, like I said, I heard that when majoring in education, a lot of the education was dealing with crowd management, running a classroom, that kind of thing. And that might not be an issue with teachers, but the very model of school as a whole. Some problems will pop up simply because of the nature of having a lot of different kids and they're all moving at different speed, and you have to find a way to make sure that they are all thriving, that kind of thing. So if training is an issue, you're going to have to, what is the real problem? What is the real expectation? And how can we address it? Lots of things have to go into solving that. And with the notion that like teachers or the administration are supposed to teach kids like right from wrong or whatnot, I really think that's a parent issue. It's not something that should be placed on teachers. So again, another issue that people have talked about, like this is what's wrong with education, is overcrowded schools. I've talked about the student teacher ratio. Now, the most obvious solution to that is build more schools. Straightforward enough, that kind of thing. Now, and this is, of course, assuming that we have a physical building, all classrooms are being utilized as well as they can, and we have staff to accommodate them, but there's still too many students, and so we have to cram them 20 plus to a teacher ratio per room, that kind of thing. So, with building a new school, I assume that the school district and local government are going to be the bankrollers, and that's a rabbit hole that I know nothing about. So, yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of people that are just saying, well, let's just build more, there's probably a lot of red tape involved in that. And of course, it's not just a matter of, securing land and then building the installation, and of course, hooking it up all to the district's infrastructure kind of thing. And of course, you have to hire teachers, staff, and everything else there. The costs rack up. It's not just, oh, just build it and it's done. So another solution to overcrowded schools that I've heard from one or two teachers is maybe, like I said, with more teachers, have a situation where you have two teachers in one of the bigger classes. So someone can lecture, they can ask for, okay, who's lost or whatnot, and they can gauge, which students are more advanced and which ones are lagging behind. And so if there's any other work, they can be grouped by those categories, and then the teachers can split up and handle each group. And so the advanced kids aren't held back, and the kids that are behind can get dedicated care. And so everyone is being attended to. I mean, within reason. That can still be a big ratio. And I've had experience teaching, and it is really hard to take care of everyone whenever someone is really far behind. That's just one person. And now if there's more than one kid that's lagging behind for whatever reason that is, yeah, it's hard to take care of everybody because you want to help that person and not just close enough. Okay, well, and try and figure it out on your own, and then you walk away. So yeah, the student to teacher ratio, if you can bring that down and just have tag team in a certain way, I can see how that would help. So overcrowded schools in general, that's a big problem, and it's probably pretty hard to tackle. And there are other things that may exacerbate that. So another issue that I hear that the problem with education is focused learning to pass standardized tests. And I hear this one a lot. And just starting off, a prominent scientist who's in the public eye who doesn't teach K through 12, he's a university level at the very least. He talked about how tests are getting in the way of students truly learning. And he made an analogy of like, if a student cheats on a test, then that's the failure of the education system to have them focused on learning. Instead, we've taught them to be focused on passing a test, and that's the failure of education. Now, there's definitely truth to the notion, in my opinion, that, there is an over focus on tests, but he didn't offer any solutions to how to do that. And again, he doesn't teach K through 12, all right? He doesn't know the pain. And it's very romantic notion of like this creating an institution where all students are, spontaneously struck with inspiration to learn and discover. So there needs to be more nuance with when we criticize things. And again, this guy teaches at the university level, to the best of my knowledge. If he's teaching a freshman class as part of the, working at a university, and every student that comes in has a different comprehension and understanding and knowledge base of prerequisite knowledge in order to be able to teach that course he's teaching, how do you coherently teach all those students? And again, college, the demands are different. You have to be much more motivated, but at the same time, if he's really that concerned with knowledge and education, he's going to have to get involved individually with these people. And juggling, some freshman science courses are like 100 people. How are you going to manage all that if they all have a different comprehension and standard because they didn't have a standard that they were held to they were all held to. And I know that no test is a perfect assessment of a student's abilities, academic or professional, or in life or whatever. But we do need some kind of standard, a bare minimum for a functional adult. And we need some way to assess the comprehension and knowledge of students to see if they are actually there. And for higher education, we need to know how ready a prospective student is for the demanding coursework because, again, 100 students in a classroom, that's a lot. And even with that group of 100, you need to make sure that, there's a reasonable expectation that they are fit to be there. Now, I personally experienced a state standardized test that was easier than what I was learning in school. Until 11th grade, that is. It suddenly got harder. And the teachers had an easy solution to this. They're like, okay, I'll teach you math and English full-time, whatever it is they're teaching. And here and there, whenever we're getting close to the standardized test, I'll give you some advice on the specifics for the testing format. And it wasn't, some of that was about, okay, A, B, C, D, one of them will be just completely wrong. One of them will be right. And the other two will be, if you made one mistake in your logic, those would seem like a good answer. Tricks like that. And so, yeah, that's not teaching you to be smart. That's teaching you how to pass a test. But again, the teachers, they were focused on teaching the subject at hand. And for the most part, from what I can tell, at the worst, the students did fine on that standardized test. Now, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. Maybe the teachers were getting back, massively bad test results and they were panicking over funding. Who knows? So in my first episode, I mentioned how I was working on a short film and I solved a budget question with skills that I learned for taking standardized tests. And it was just like, okay, let me recount the situation again. We were working on a short film. We were shooting in a state that was going to give us tax rebates, but the tricky thing was that, okay, if the amount of money you spend in total for the project plus 30% of that amount is less than $50,000, then we would get either a tax break or we would get like a refund or something like that. And so they're like, oh, how do we figure that out? Okay, I was like, all right, well, what are the important things? 50,000, that's the amount we have to be under. We have X, the amount of money we spend, plus 30% of X, 0.3X. So X plus 0.3X equals 50,000. I know it's less than, but we're doing an equation. So I just did a little, algebra and found out that X was equal to, or 1.3X is equal 50,000. So divide 50,000 by 1.3 and you get your answer. And again, a lot of that was just using like tricks of how to approach a word problem that you were going to see in standardized tests. And all of my companions were in awe, but we all went to the same school. I know that they knew what I did, and if they put their heads to it, they would have figured it out soon. But the reaction I got whenever I just did this basic, arithmetic was like they thought I was a genius, and I'm like, this is easy. And what I didn't mention in that first episode was that several of those companions of mine had criticized standardized tests in the past. And I'm like, I literally use the skills to get a word problem and figure it out. So my point being, I'm open to suggestions to improving standardized tests or finding an alternative to whatever issue that they claim to address. But I do believe that they do serve a purpose and they can't be chucked out wholesale. And a lot of people do acknowledge that the nuance of that, but there's some people that saying, oh, just throw out all testing and we'll kind of wing it in a way of like, how do we know that all the kids are at a certain level? And yeah, so it's tricky. And yeah, I spoke this past weekend with a guy who was a teacher, and he talked about, he'd been teaching for decades. And like I said, with that multiple choice of like, okay, deductive reasoning for A, B, C, and D. But like I said, there were some things that, okay, here's a word problem. And people are like, well, why am I calculating the, how much money this many rolls of toilet paper costs. Because, like, well, that's the thing. In real life, problems are going to come your way and they aren't going to be so easily presented to you. You're going to have to figure out what the situation is, what you're really looking for, what is important for that, and what is not. And one of the skills I learned for passing a standardized test, they're like, okay, every question that's going to be given to you, there's going to be some information in there that is not relevant to solving the problem. So you need to identify it and then cross it out so that you're not being distracted. Now, of course, there's nuance to that. But yeah, as an adult, I found that whenever I'm in situations with people and we got a problem, it seems a lot of people get caught up on things that don't matter. And maybe that's just me, but hey, that's all I have to work on, or work with, rather. So, another issue, this is kind of like standardized tests, but it's different, which is learning to get into college. Now, college is held in high regard for sure, but just like learning to pass tests, I've heard that putting too much focus on everything that they're doing in high school needs to be focused on looking appealing on a college resume. That might also be hurting their education too. And I remember way back in the day when I was in high school, how much of an importance the notion of college application was when I was picking my freshman classes in high school. And I would learn at least that with high school, at least that first year, you have a lot more flexibility and time than I was made to believe. And one of my teachers, well, when I was signing up for classes, we met with a counselor, and they're like, "Oh, if you want to look impressive, take as many either advanced placement or pre-advanced placement, we weren't there yet, courses as you could." And that looks more appealing, that you're smart and you're going after everything. But that freshman year, I and a lot of kids were really burnt out that, signed up for every honors class we could. And one of the teachers who was teaching one of those honors classes said, I hate when the counselors suggest that, because at least for freshman year, they're typically not ready for that huge leap in demands, and also like with extracurriculars too, all the stuff they got going on. So like she said, my advice would be, when you're picking your courses for freshman year, figure out what you're best at and definitely take those at whatever level is appropriate. But the things that you're worse at, take it at something that's, more normal, I guess. And so, yeah, that was a big point of contention. And there was one honors course that year that I'm like, yeah, also the teacher was legitimately bad. So I had to drop out of that and back to regulars. Now, the next year I was in honors again in science. So that was good. I previously mentioned that ideally, when done with high school, a student should have a baseline competence in certain areas to be a well-adjusted adult or a well-adjusted student when they're going to college. Now, and a lot of people, when they're saying they should teach this in schools, they're teaching like, okay, these skills should be taught in high school so that when they're an adult, they aren't getting hoodwinked, that kind of thing. And with that, even with all of the stuff that people are piling on, the bar isn't really too high, in my opinion. Now, the tricky thing is, how do you design a school model that prepares kids to go into an engineering school, but also that same model also has other kids ready to start their own business or to be a teacher or to, I don't know, do something else? It's hard to, it's not one size fits all, but one size prepares everyone for whatever anything they want to do. Now, I know like a lot of things like engineering or whatnot will address a lot of that specific knowledge or curriculum, but a lot of adults are reporting that they wished high school, like, because they covered the basics, but they knew what they wanted to do, and they wish that high school bridged the gap better. And they wish that high school encouraged their interests more beyond just college. And in my high school, there were special courses for kids who were interested in health careers, where they would one of their periods would be to go to a local hospital, or maybe it was like 2 periods, and they would do some kind of work with patients or shadowing, that kind of thing. And they had a couple of other equivalents in other fields. So it's definitely possible to help students get a better taste of adulthood and what they may want to do. But again, it is really hard to design that for a large amount of students. And if a school isn't providing this for your kids, again, this is the Having Initiative podcast. Have initiative and explore your options of how to help them and inform them in whatever they're interested in. So, lowered standards. And this one I'm really passionate about. I've spoken about my education and how I thought it was pretty good, at least K through 12. But about maybe almost 10 years after graduating, I saw some coursework from a student that was at the school that I went to, and I felt that some of the things that I saw in the curriculum of courses that I took, from what I could remember, it seemed a little easier. And not just easier, like I can walk through this, but it didn't demand as much thought. So I've had concerns about lowered standards. Now, maybe that student was in basic courses and I was in the advanced one. I don't remember what they were doing, but there were some things where, like, yeah, they're in pre-AP. It was like English, and they were in a more advanced placement thing, and the like questions that they were told to answer were not nearly as demanding as the ones I had to do back in the day. But I saw some states say that I saw an article that one state, they weren't requiring advanced math to graduate high school. Now, and I saw a lot of, comments and saying like, well, this is just awful and that kind of thing. Now, this is tricky because if those advanced math courses are still offered at the school or district, then that's cool. Students who I think math is important, but I don't think that every student that goes out of school needs to be, pre-cal, needs to understand everything going on in pre-calculus. And from what I remember, to graduate, you needed 3 years of math at my high school, and whatever those 3 years were depended on, whatever level you were at. And again, I think math is important, but yeah, I see there is definitely a threshold that I would say everyone needs to be at in order to graduate high school, but most people don't need advanced math. And the problem solving, again, I'm not an expert on this, and maybe I'll change my mind, but the problem solving skills that you have in advanced math aren't that different from the, algebra 1 kind of things. Algebra 2 just, it was starting to go into sine and cosine and other things, and that it was just more advanced mathematics and not necessarily the skills that you would learn from problem solving that you had already learned in the lower levels. So I'm getting off topic, sorry. So if the school still offered the advanced courses but didn't require every student to get them in order to graduate, then cool. The more math-oriented kids can keep taking those advanced courses, and then the ones who want to go and who aren't good at math and want to go into other fields can focus on those other ones. And if they want to focus on learning how to run a business, they can take a financial literacy course, something like that. But I have heard a school district or two that straight up banned honors courses for the purposes of either equality or equity. And that's an awful idea, banning the honors courses, because, some kids were doing better than others. So in order to, have the kids be more equal, they just didn't let the smarter kids thrive. And that's an awful idea. You are handicapping kids. And I believe it was in Washington State and maybe a district in Minnesota, or maybe Minnesota as a whole. But I saw that at least in Washington, the governors say that there was a racial disparity in graduating high school due to literary scores and other subjects as well. And the solution that they came up with was to drop the requirements for literacy and math. And now, since, the kids who aren't, failing to read or write and aren't good at math can graduate high school, so we have a more equitable outcome. And those kids who were, graduated when they didn't have, basic knowledge of things, they are going to suffer in the workforce because they are far behind on reading specifically. That no matter what field you're going into, you need to know how to read. And a lot of lowering standards has been passed off as being compassionate. And yeah, that really makes me angry. That's not good for anybody, and it's especially not good for the kids that you claim to be helping. So sorry, I got a little passionate there. It's just really freaking stupid. Now, the good news is that I know a second grade teacher who said in their experience over their 20 plus years of teaching that there's actually been more pressure to better education earlier and faster with reading and math. Start them young. That's the attitude. So that's good. So I think, generally speaking, pursuing a higher standard within reason is best. And yes, there needs to be nuance because, like, impossible demands aren't helping people, and how you get them there, stuff like that. There's nuance to be had, but lowering the bar, you should rarely ever lower the bar. And if you do so, it should only be because we have proof that the bar being too high is hurting people. So another issue that people talk about what's wrong with education is government intervention. And I'm going to try and not be political on here. And again, depending on what the government is doing, what the action is, or the political motive, people from all over the political spectrum will agree or disagree with the politicians saying that now schools have to teach this or they can't teach this, that kind of thing. And literally everyone, 1 minute they will say, yes, good on the governor for passing this bill that says we can or can't teach that. And then on a flip with another issue saying they should not be involved in dictating what our students have to or cannot learn in schools. It is truly impressive. So I hear people say, they should teach in school. And oftentimes I find what they are suggesting to be useful. That's good knowledge. But again, we're demanding more and more and more. They should teach this and that and this and that and this and that. And of course, there are things where I think, no, that should not be the responsibility of the school to teach. So when the government gets involved, there can be good policies that they are putting forth or bad policies. And that's a tricky subject. And there's always, people's personal interpretation of things and their views and whatnot. So real quick, when I say government, it could be federal all the way down to the school district, whether or not that counts or whatnot. And I've had some eye-opening conversation with teachers who have laid out how policies at various level, federal, state, district, that kind of thing, were either really good or really bad. And again, like I said, to have a positive outcome, everyone needs to be invested in the student learning or getting smarter, however you want to define it. And some actions can be made to benefit local businesses or big business or teachers unions or ideologues in the electorate or campaign promises that weren't good but were popular. So not every sweet talker is interested in doing what they campaigned on once they're in office. And of course, funding is an issue, whether to increase or decrease, oversight on how it is spent, if it's reallocated in the correct way. There's lots of possibilities as to why a policy with good intentions can have bad results, or of course, they could just be straight up bad from the start. And a caveat, generally, politicians aren't educators, whether by their degree or their personal experience. Now, they may have advisors or like a cabinet, or they may meet with teachers and talk to them, but they usually aren't educators. Now, there was this legislation called No Child Left Behind, and on the surface, I did a cursory review over what it was and why they argued with it and why it failed. And from what I can tell, there were good intentions with it, just bad implementation. And how bad, that's up to debate, and I'm not going into that. But again, the ideal was they wanted to improve education. And so, yeah, nobody defends No Child Left Behind. But again, nobody criticizes the notion of we want kids to do better. And so I need to go back a little bit when I talked about how the government, and I said I don't know if the school district counts as government because I know some things are voted on and other things aren't. But a teacher that I talked to, again, they had been teaching for a long time. They talked about how just at the school level, a principal could set good or bad policy with, how to handle kids or helping teachers if they're struggling, or just enacting basically bureaucratic paperwork that didn't help anybody, that kind of thing. And that was just the principal. They also talked about how like vice principals or administrators, whatever they're called, that they could basically tag on a lot of work that wasn't necessary. But he also talked about how they had policies where, like, okay, this is the protocol for dealing with this student, and we test them at this point, and we test them at that point. If we find they're lagging behind or whatnot, then we address it immediately. Policies that were good and that were more, labor intensive, but also policies that were labor intensive and like this isn't helping anyone, that kind of thing. And that's all within one school. Now, they also mentioned district policies that they didn't like, or state ones, with demanding how much they put into standardized tests, or federal policies, that kind of thing. There's all different levels of where something can go wrong by some, I don't want to say government, but authority saying you have to do this, and what they're saying is bad. And the danger I see with government getting involved is that usually, like I said, they aren't made by people who are educators. And of course, even amongst educators, there's going to be lots of disagreement with how to solve issues. And there's going to be a variety of issues that some great educators have never had to deal with. But the issue with government, that again, they're not educators, oftentimes policies that come from the top down are monolithic. They are very, standardized, uniform, and very much you have to do them. And yes, we need standards, but we also need diversity and variability with how to implement them, or how to, factor in students, because students are diverse and variable. So another issue, this is a big one with education these days, are parents not being involved. So I know a teacher, or several, and I asked them about learning how to read. And they talked about how some students did better than others. And the students that lagged, he noticed quite frequently that they did not practice at home. And it wasn't necessarily the student not wanting to read, it was the parents not, participating. They wouldn't read to them. They wouldn't talk to them beyond basic instructions. And yes, I learned that like talking to your kids, that's helps them learn to speak. So speaking, reading, writing, they're all, when you're that young, they're all intertwined. You do them all simultaneously and one feeds the other, that kind of thing. And some parents, they wouldn't even do that ABC song, A, B, C, D. And that really upset me. If you ask me how to handicap a child from succeeding in life, I'd say, yeah, just don't help them. And he noticed that it was mostly minority students where this home environment, that's what was going on. And the person stated that the child will not thrive if they don't practice at home. He said, I can't fix this. And he's a good guy. He loves his job. He takes it seriously. And he wants to help the kids, but he said he cannot fix this, at least not with all students. Like maybe if he had one, then yeah, he could do it. But, he's got a class to teach. So more and more people blame teachers and school policy or government policy. And there's definitely some to go around depending on the situation. But a lot of times parents deserve the blame. Now, my parents were heavily involved, at least until middle school, and it really helped. I was at different times, ahead in certain subjects, not because I showed up to class, listened to the teacher, did the homework, and I just excelled, but because of the other stuff that they were doing with me. And two examples. Like when I was in elementary school, like third grade, my mom over the summer me and my siblings would get around and we would read Romeo and Juliet. Now that was way too advanced for my reading level at the time, and I hated it. But she forced me to do it anyway because it was good for me. And also over the summer, um, my dad, who was a software engineer, wanted me to work on my multiplication tables, and so he built a program that would run on the computer that would, display math problems. I'd input the answers and hit submit, and I'd get told whether I was right or wrong. And he would come home and was like, "How'd you do?" I'm like, "This is what I got." I was like, "Oh, you need to do better," that kind of thing. And I tried to basically lie and say, "Oh yeah, I did it, and I got 9 out of 10 right." And he was like, "Good." Problem is that my dad, being the software engineer, built logging into the application, and so he could tell whether or not I had taken the test, and if I had taken the test, what my actual score was. And he did this because he cared. Bottom line. And with reading, yeah, I wasn't prepared for Shakespeare, but then one year I discovered this series of books called Animorphs, and I could not put them down. I wanted to read, and I wanted to, when we went to the playground, I brought my book with me and I just sat on the slide and read. So, like my previous point, if they aren't teaching something important in schools, or the government hasn't mandated that the schools teach something that you deem important, or whatnot, whatever the issue is, as a parent, you can teach the kids yourself. I mean, and if you don't feel good about teaching it, there's a tremendous amount of resources online for help. You know, like I said, my dad, he was a software engineer. He built that, and then eventually he bought some learning programs because I like computers, and they were much more entertaining than doing his multiplication program exercise. And but now these days on free quote unquote websites and YouTube or whatnot, there's so much stuff K through 12 to inform someone, whether at various levels. And if they're, the kids in high school and you think they need to learn more about finance or whatnot, again, a lot of that stuff, there's paid stuff, of course, but there's also free things. And if you don't feel comfortable doing it, you can show them that and work with what you have. And still on the notion of parents, there's a lot of parents that are using public school, as free daycare. And when I talked about how, better training about they want teachers to be able to, they want teachers or the admin to be, mental health experts and counselors and whatnot. And they want the teachers to teach the kids morality and right for wrong and that kind of thing. That's your job as a parent. And a lot of parents are just, they want the schools to do that because evidently they don't have the stomach to do it themselves or whatever reason. So, like I said, all parties involved must care about that positive outcome. So, something to bear in mind. So, another big issue, and this is probably the least definable one that I hear about with what's wrong with education, is the students and how society is doing detrimental things to them. So when people talk about what's hurting students, a lot of things are put out there. Social media, COVID isolation, bullying, the decay of culture and civilization as a whole, peer pressure, drugs, video game addiction, porn addiction, and many, many more. And yeah, all of those things can affect a student's desire to learn, ability to learn, that kind of thing. And I do care about those problems for their own sake, but right now we're talking about education. So what's the solution for all those things affecting a student? Like, which issue? It depends. But I mean, parents, for sure, they can definitely, have a hand in that. And I've been reading a book about like boys and girls and how they develop and that kind of thing. And the scientist who wrote the book, it seems very smart and knowledgeable about the problem. And so many things they recommend, the parent, how do we fix this thing? You as a parent have to be a parent. And he wrote another book that was like The End of Parenting, where he talks about how, parents are afraid to say no or to set boundaries, that kind of thing. And he says, you have to do that for the sake of your child. And so people have been putting pressure on teachers and the admin to be like life counselors to solve these things. And again, there's room for some of that, but these are a lot of issues for like if a therapist, a professional therapist, has one student, that can be a whole process. Now we expect a teacher who can have like maybe in high school they have rotating courses. They can have like over 100 students that they have to teach and also be a therapist too, or a counselor or an administrator who's in charge of hundreds of students. Yeah, it's not like the counselor to student ratio is in the hundreds, whereas a parent to child ratio is, depending on the size of the family, 1 to 1 or maybe more. And so like a lot of those things are societal issues, and yeah, like that's a huge issue to try and fix, and it's tricky. And people are really divided on social and political issues right now, but I think if we put our heads together, I find we agree on a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. And yeah, I'll just say it again. I think parents are most influential in protecting the well-being of a child. Teachers are busy enough as it is. And I saw, I'm reluctant to even say this, but a TikTok challenge where students would go and destroy a bathroom, just, oh, damn, I forgot the legal term for it, but ransack it. And we've seen, the Tide Pod challenge and things in our culture where children are being encouraged to be stupid for the, admiration of their peers. And so, yeah, we can't put that on teachers. It ain't their fault. I blame the parents every time I see a kid do something like that. And so there's bad kids acting out. And I've also seen this is another problem, that teachers can't quote unquote discipline them. Now, I'm not saying we should bring back the paddle, but I've seen school or district or government policies that say like no matter how bad a child behaves, the teacher can't reprimand them at all. They can't suspend them or anything. And students are learning this, and they are, the smarter ones are exploiting it. Like that TikTok challenge, like they know, like I can do this and nothing bad will happen to me. And it's funny because a lot of the people that make those policies about how a teacher can't reprimand or punish a student, they're also pushing the idea that education is important. We want all children to thrive. And that's why they say that the teacher can't punish the student, is because, this is all about the student. If we, punish them or suspend them, that affects the child's education. But at the same time, they also tend to think that teachers are, they think that if we just pay them more, that will fix the issue. And a bad kid that is not in school to learn will drag all the kids around them down and prevent them from thriving. It's not even as simple as like, oh, like that bad kid forms a gang and they all, serve that kid. Just being a distraction affects the learning of all the other children. And seem to believe the opposite for some reason, that no, if we put the bad kid with a bunch of good kids, they'll fix him. And that ain't how it works. Ask any teacher or just even any parent. Like, parents are very instinctive about positive influences. So there was a meme of parents now and then. And so like the meme that was of back then, sorry, is that it showed a picture of like a student or parent teacher conference where the teacher's on one side of the desk and the student and parent are on the other, and there's a bad grade, and the parent is saying to the student, the parent is saying to the student, why did this happen, or what did you do wrong, that kind of thing. And then the other half of the meme says now, the present day, and it shows the same setup, but it shows the the parent shouting at the teacher, why did this happen? Basically, the exact same phrase. And so every situation is different, and any party could be responsible in some way or another, and that's what determines the plan of action. But we can't just. I know I've been talking about issues with students, but it is kind of turning into parents part two. Bottom line, have initiative, figure out what the real issue going on with your child is, and then figure out the solution to address that. That's my 2 cents. So, thank you for listening to this first part, everybody. I know that was a lot, and I got passionate here and there. I hope you know that I do try and be objective with all of this. So, in part two, I'm going to be talking about quote unquote alternatives to not just things that we can do to solve these problems outside of just, teachers and parents. So, thank you all for listening. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Hi, everybody. Thank you for listening. So, I recorded this whole season at the end of last year, maybe like, September through October was kind of recording it. But it was close to the holidays with Thanksgiving and then Christmas and then New Year's. And I didn't want to contest releasing during that. So I pushed it off till this year. So that's why I'm releasing this now. And I'm recording this basically the day before you hear it. And there's been some developments with things that I mentioned in this episode. So you're going to hear about it right now. Shortly after I recorded this episode last year, reports came out of a dramatic drop in math, reading, and I believe science scores across America. And depending on the news outlet, they phrased it in certain ways. There's an episode where I talk about political alignment, so it's quite telling. But some said because of COVID, and some said because of our response to COVID. I'll let you think of that however you will. So anyway, some of the metrics about this drop in math and reading scores were, the figures they gave were either half to 2 years of lost education occurred. And I've also heard that another metric was that there was continual growth in math and reading scores, and then because of 2020 and thereafter, about 10 years of that improvement was undone. So here's a couple of specifics that I found. Chicago, 22 schools have 0 students that can read at grade level. I don't know if that is in 2023 or if it's a fairly recent metric. And 33 schools have 0 kids that can do math at grade level. And in California, I've heard lots of bad metrics, but what I saw is 42.1% of third graders can read at grade level, meaning the rest can't. And that's a big deal because I've been hearing from teachers and educational resources that third grade is a pretty big point for literacy. If you're not at grade level there, then you're going to be lagging behind, and it's going to be a big uphill battle to catch up because they start to take off after that. More is expected of you just as you grow. And Baltimore, 23 schools have 0 kids that can do math at grade level. This is a very recent report. But hey, there's 20 additional schools that have 1 or 2 students that are proficient at math at grade level. So I guess that's an improvement. Yikes. So whenever you hear these metrics, you might be thinking, more funding, that's the most common one, or the blame the schools or the superintendent. That's true. That may be a possibility. But in terms of money, I stumbled upon a metric that people were, trying to associate money invested to positive outcomes. They showed 2 counties that had similar test scores. This was like in the Midwest. And so the test scores were essentially the same, but one school had invested $2,000 to $5,000 more per student. $2,000 to $5,000 more per student. So at $2,000, that's a big jump. But again, it didn't improve test scores, at least in relation to their sister county. And in terms of blaming the school or whatnot, here's a story. In this episode, I listed 10 reasons that people have associated with bad education in America or anywhere else. And it's complicated. So here's a story that kind of involves more. There was a student in Baltimore within the past year who was a senior, I believe, and at the end of his senior year, he had a 0.13 GPA. He had missed 359 days of high school, and he had passed or three classes in his high school career. And he was supposed to graduate, but once these metrics came out, he was pushed back to ninth grade. Now that 0.13 GPA, he was ranked 62 out of 120 students, meaning there's 58 that were worse than he was. Now, when people see this article, they blame the school and blame the district. They don't quite know how was he allowed to progress if he was missing that much school and if he was failing that much. But they were blaming either the school, this district, or the government for allowing a policy that allowed him to advance with these failures. Now, remember what I mentioned earlier about how some places want to remove math and reading requirements for graduation? But his mother was interviewed about this, and she was understandably upset. She seemed to care about his well-being. And yeah, having to go back to ninth grade is a big psychological blow, especially when you're becoming an adult. But the question came up in the comments, how did she not know that this was going on for years? Where has she been now that he's essentially, quote unquote, graduated, but he has to go back and do high school again? And who knows, maybe her son was really good at forging school letters or something like that. But this is what I meant about if you want a good outcome, everyone involved needs to have that vested interest in a student's success, and they need to put forth the effort to do it. And with that story, I looked at comments on YouTube and articles, and the sentiment that I agreed with the most was that many people failed this boy. And I would lump him in with the people that failed him, to be honest. So, and yeah, it's easy to look at stories like these, especially if you don't live there or don't know these people and judge, but I'm trying to focus on solutions. So, next episode, I talk a bit about learning outside of school, but after seeing these metrics about the COVID impacts that I mentioned, I really hope that people start to take their education and their children's education into their own hands, regardless of what situation is. Even if you're going to the best school possible, don't sit idle and rest on your laurels. I mentioned in episode 1 of this podcast, we have more power than ever before. It's time we start using it. So, thank you all for listening. If you have any thoughts or concerns about what was covered here or in general with education, please contact me on social media. I'm currently on Instagram, Facebook, Minds, Getter, and MeWe, although 1 or 2 of those might change. And I may be adding Twitter. I'm debating right now. And my handle for pretty much all of these is either Having Initiative or Have Initiative. I think there was one that it doesn't allow you to have that long of a name. So please look for my logo and reach out to me on there with any thoughts or concerns you may have. And if you want to support this podcast, please leave a review on Apple, Google, or Spotify podcasts. And of course, share this episode or any others that you find interesting with others. So thank you again, and I hope you'll tune in for part 2 of education. There's some important things that need to be talked about. Okay, thank you, everybody. Take care. Okay, so that 8 minutes that you just heard, it's been months since I released the original release, so there wasn't a great way of editing the ending, so I'm just tagging on to the end of it again. I'm sorry about the confusion. This is housekeeping part 2. So thank you for listening to this episode. I really appreciate it. It's been months since I released this episode on the podcast platforms, and I'm sorry about the delay. I got swamped with life stuff, but I'm back now. So thank you for picking up again. Since releasing this episode, I've heard more bad statistics about education. And not just heard statistics, but seen the lowering of the cognitive ability of the average college student and adult, of course, and also just a couple of kids in lower grade levels. I've seen more lowering of standards, and I've seen more people just talking past each other. They all claim they care about education, but they assume that as soon as someone disagrees with them on what the solution is, that they must not care. And I'm not seeing anybody being the rallying cry. So I've been working on something to help. It's an educational resource, and that's all I can say for now. I'm sorry to be mysterious or teasing, but it's a work in progress and I don't want to oversell. But I wanted to let you know that, per the name of my podcast, I am trying to have initiative and use what we have. So thank you again for listening. If you want to support the channel, please like or comment on this video or subscribe to my channel. Or better yet, share this episode with someone that you think needs to hear it. And if they disagree, then I hope they send comments my way. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope you tune in for part 2. Take care.